Well, I'm guessing you're familiar with names like Muhammad Ali, Joe Frazier, Leon Spinks, Mike Tyson. But are you familiar with the name of James Braddock? It's a fascinating story that was depicted in a Ron Howard film entitled The Cinderella Man quite some time ago. James Braddock was a professional boxer in the 1920s who enjoyed a lot of success, but all that changed in 1933. In the thick of the Great Depression, Jim was actually forced into retirement by a string of losing decisions and a broken hand. And soon the Bulldog of Bergen was scrambling for work alongside 15 million other unemployed Americans. At the bottom of the barrel, Jim swallowed his pride, hung up his boxing gloves, and filed for government relief to help support his family. But then Jim's luck began to change. The number 2 heavyweight in the world needed a last-minute replacement to fight for $250, and the fact that Jim had never been knocked out made him an attractive storyline. Donning makeshift gloves and a fighter's robe with the wrong name on it, Jim was simply expected to show up, take a few hits, and collect his paycheck. But then the unexpected happened. Jim knocked out his opponent. One victory led to another until finally Braddock got his shot on June 13th, 1935 at Madison Square Garden, New York. James Braddock, a 10-1 underdog, entered the ring to face Max Baer. Max Baer, an arrogant giant, possibly the hardest hitter of all time, who had already killed 2 men in the ring. In an amazing feat of courage and determination, Braddock won that 15-round decision to become the heavyweight champion of the world. You know, it really doesn't matter whether it's Rocky Balboa versus Apollo Creed, or Milan High School versus Muncie Central, or the 1980 U.S. Olympic hockey team versus the Russians. The fact is, everybody loves it when the underdog overcomes insurmountable odds and upsets a strongly favored opponent, right? But you could make the case that the biggest underdog upset of all time is found in the pages of our Bible, and that's where I direct your attention this morning to 1 Samuel chapter 17. 1 Samuel 17, we'll pick up our study there, about halfway through the Old Testament. Just last Sunday, we began a brand new series. We're calling it A Heart Like His, and so we're studying the life of David. I told you last week that David is the only person in the entire Bible to be designated a man after God's own heart. And once you hear that, it raises the obvious question, doesn't it? What qualities or characteristics made David's heart like God's? And then in turn, conversely, what qualities or characteristics can give us a heart like David's? Last Sunday, we noted that David had a faithful heart. Today, we'll discover that he had a fearless heart. The account before us this morning has captured the imagination of every boy and girl who's ever sat in a circle of small wooden chairs in a Sunday school room. It's a familiar story. The vast majority of us already know the outcome. But let's listen again, and as we do, please understand that this is far more than just a bedtime story. It's an account with rich theological ramifications and timely application for our day. It's interesting, even people who know very little about the Bible will use the analogy of David and Goliath. And so you'll hear sportscasters, I've heard it in recent weeks, this is a David and Goliath matchup. We were watching Survivor a couple weeks ago, and they divided into teams, and they looked lopsided, and one of them made this is a David and Goliath battle. And so it's interesting. Our world is well aware of the account that we're going to study today, but do they truly understand just how profound it is. Let me establish this setting if I could today. The nation of Israel was once again in peril at the hands of their enemies, the Philistines. The armies were drawn up on opposite sides of the valley of Elah, be a few miles southwest of Jerusalem. On this occasion, rather than have the armies of Israel and the Philistines engage in a full-scale battle with extensive loss of life, they came up with this idea, hey, let's have two representatives face off. Mano y mano, right? With the understanding that whoever won, their whole army won. Whoever lost, their whole army lost. Well, for the Philistines, it was a no-brainer. They chose as their combatant a mighty warrior named Goliath. And you find his intimidating description there in verse 4 and following. You don't have to read very far before you recognize this Goliath guy was one incredible human specimen. We try to translate the figures here that the scriptures describe. 6 cubits in a span really translates out to over 9 foot tall, okay? Over 9 foot. Gang, you know what? That's the Terminator with a thyroid condition right there, okay? That's what I'm saying. No, really, this guy would have made Zach Eady look like Danny DeVito, okay? No, seriously. I tried to get a side-by-side. Nobody had one out there, so that's the best I could do. And then check out his attire, right? Read down through that again. He's decked out in a coat of armor from his shoulders to his knees that weighed roughly 125 pounds, maybe more. Not only that, but he wore a bronze helmet, bronze shin guards. Get the picture here. Goliath was a humongous mass of brass. Like if the sun was shining, you had to wear sunglasses to even look his direction. And to make matters worse, if that was even possible, he had a javelin across his back. He carried a spear, the shaft of which resembled a small tree trunk, and the iron point of that weighed roughly 15 pounds. That would be equivalent to one of our modern-day bowling balls. And if that isn't intimidating enough, the text informs us here that every day this alleged champion lumbered up and down the slopes of the valley of Elah, belching out his boastful bravado. And what did he say? Fee, fi, fo. No, that's a different giant. I'm sorry. He didn't say that. Now, here's what he said in verses 8 and following. Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? Are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he's able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us. This day I defy the ranks of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other. Giants. We all face them, don't we? We've all been intimidated by them. And it's easy to brag about how we're going to handle them as long as they're miles away harassing somebody else. But it's an altogether different story when we find ourselves staring them in the kneecaps on our own front porch. And yet it's precisely at that point that we need to follow David's example. So we're going to break it down into 3 different battle strategies. If you haven't already found the outline, now would be a good time to track it down. We hand those out to you if you pick one up on the way in. Fill in the blanks, jot down some references. 3 strategies that come through in this battle that are going to be helpful to us in facing our giants. First of all, strategy number 1, refuse to be intimidated by your giant's size. Goliath, he didn't issue this challenge one time and then just walk away. No, this went on every morning and evening for over 40 days. So at least 80 times that we know of, 80 times he marched out into the valley, flaunting his stuff, taunting his enemies. And you're probably not going to believe this, but no one was willing to take him up on his gracious offer. That is until day 41, right? On day 41, a good-looking, muscular teenager strolled into camp. He was the youngest in a family of 8 boys. And he'd been sent by his father with supplies to check up on his 3 older brothers who were actually in Israel's army. You can see it there on the screen. Jesse had sent him with some bread and also some cheese for the troops. Somebody pointed out that if Jesse had just included marinara, David would have been the first pizza delivery guy in the Bible. So there's that. On arrival, David, the young shepherd, fresh from the wilderness, fresh from the sheep, most importantly, fresh from the presence of God, right? David could not believe what he was hearing. You see it there in verses 22 and 23. David is standing there talking to his brothers, and all of a sudden he hears Goliath launch into his spiel, and suddenly everybody starts scrambling for cover, except for David. In fact, you get the impression from verse 24 that he may have been the only one who didn't. And notice his reaction in the last part of verse 26. Who is this godless, uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? And so in similar fashion, gang, the giants we face are seldom a one-shot confrontation. No, much like Goliath, they show up every day, don't they? They're relentless in their attempts to wear us down and intimidate. They come in the form of a person or a pressure or a worry that constantly hammers on our heart every morning and night. And it's unfortunate, but I'm afraid too often we respond much like the army of Israel here. You see, they were asking this question: how big is Goliath compared to man? And we have a tendency to do the same thing, don't we? We have a tendency to measure our obstacle, our giant, over against our abilities and our strength. Is it any wonder we feel overwhelmed and defeated before the battle even begins? You see, when we do that, essentially we're asking the wrong question. The question that we need to be asking is this: how big is this giant compared to my God? Right? How big is this giant compared to our God? We need a fresh perspective. Goliath compared to man was a formidable opponent. Goliath compared to God was incredibly puny, which is precisely the perspective that enabled David to do what he did. In a word, we would call it courage. But in reality, it goes by a number of names: boldness, fearless, bravery, valor, backbone, intestinal fortitude, grit, guts. The idea is that of inner strength, the determination to hang in there against all odds, to persevere and withstand hardship. Courage is what makes the amputee reject pity and continue to take life by the throat. Courage is what causes a struggling married couple to say, let's stick it out. We can make this work. Courage is what enables the widow to face yet another day. Courage is what sustains a young mother with a household of toddlers and a mountain of dirty laundry. Courage is what keeps a nation free from terrorism. Courage feeds on giants. It chews them up and spits them out. I'll tell you what, gang, it's impossible to live victoriously for Christ without courage. In fact, the Bible actually gives us numerous examples of this quality. Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego revealed it when they refused to bow down to Nebuchadnezzar's golden image. Elijah displayed it in his showdown with the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. Job showed it after losing everything. He still remained faithful to God. And Daniel demonstrated it when he refused to compromise his convictions, even if it meant spending a night in the lion's den. I could give you other examples. You get the idea. What was their secret? How did they do that? They had learned, they knew that our God is faithful and that his strength is more than adequate for whatever trials we might be facing. And so they simply refused to buckle under pressure. How about it, gang? How long are you going to allow your giant to intimidate you? Stop comparing him to your strength and abilities and start measuring him up start measuring him over against the power and strength of our God. Strategy number 1, refuse to be intimidated by your giant size. Strategy number 2, rely on God's strength and not human abilities. Deep down, King Saul, who would have been the tallest of all the Israelites, he knew he was the most likely candidate to take on Goliath. The problem was he wasn't walking with God, and so as a result, he's terrified. That's why he came up with Plan B, to create some incentive for others. He promised the man who killed Goliath great riches, a permanent tax exemption, and his daughter's hand in marriage. Well, 2 out of 3 is still a pretty good deal, isn't it, right? So when David starts asking questions and indicating an interest in mixing it up with the big fella, it doesn't take long for word to reach the king, who's been desperately searching for a volunteer. And since there wasn't a long line of applicants, the young shepherd was immediately ushered in to see the king. You can see it there in verse 32. David says, "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him." Now, King Saul, in spite of David's bravery, apparently still has some doubts. Goliath was a seasoned warrior, David merely an untrained youth. But as if to erase those doubts from Saul's mind, the son of Jesse responds with some pretty impressive credentials of his own. Let's pick it up there. "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." Someone put it like this. Here was David's attitude. Unbelief said that Goliath was too big to hit. Faith said he was too big to miss. And that was David's perspective. So often when facing our giants, we forget what we ought to remember and remember what we ought to forget. We remember our defeats and we forget our victories. Most of us can recite the failures of our lives in vivid details, but we're hard-pressed to name the specific, remarkable victories that God has pulled off in our past. Well, it wasn't that way with David. His testimony was, "I'm not doing this in my own strength. God will empower me. Let me at him. I can do this." And that attitude is further revealed now in what follows in verses 38 and 39. Saul offers David his royal armor, which I guess makes sense, because if he wasn't going to use it, somebody ought to get some use out of it, right? And I wish we had pictures in our Bible, because this scene had to be very comical, don't you think? This young teen tries on armor of a middle-aged king who was twice his size. And finally, see it there on the screen, David made the choice and said, I can't do this. I'm not accustomed to these. Can you see it there, gang? He was determined to do this in God's strength. And so verse 40, right? He took a staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, and with a sling in his hand, he went out to introduce himself to the Philistine. What was David's secret here? If you get a chance sometime this week, I want to encourage you, do your own study and read down through 1 Samuel 17 and list, first of all list in one column all the observations that David made about Goliath. I counted 2. One statement in verse 26 to the soldier standing nearby, and one to Saul about Goliath in verse 32. That's the only 2 I found. 2 Goliath-related comments, and maybe even more significantly, no questions. You say, Gary, what do you mean? Well, no inquiries about Goliath's skill. He didn't ask about his 1-loss record, did he? Nothing about the weight of his spear, the size of his shield, or the meaning of the skull and crossbones tattooed on the giant's bicep. And in sharp contrast to that, David devotes a great deal of attention to God. I counted 9 references, and I'll show you some of those in just a second. 9 God thoughts. So what am I saying? I'm saying God thoughts outnumbered Goliath thoughts 9-2. That's a significant ratio. Can I ask you today, how does that ratio compare with yours? God thoughts opposed to your giant's thoughts. God never intended for us to do this alone. He never intended us to face the giants of our life in our own strength. On the contrary, he reminds us time and time again that we will overcome only as we rely on him. So strategy number 1, refuse to be intimidated by the giant's size. Strategy 2, rely on God's strength as opposed to ours. Strength number 3, resolve to give God the credit for the victory. Finally, the moment of truth arrives as the 2 combatants approach each other, and the giant very quickly sizes up his opponent. He sees he's a young man, not a seasoned warrior, and so he launches into his tirade. Goliath is the original trash talker in the Bible, okay? So verse 43 says, "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his God. "Come here," he said, "I'll give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field." Well, David can talk smack as well. Look what he says, and here's where you see now some of those references to God in the discourse here, 1 Samuel 17. He says, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin. I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." That's a significant word. And I didn't count that one up, but that would be something else as you're reading through. How many times does David point out that Goliath was defying the name, the glory of God? "This day the Lord will hand you over to me, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. Today I'll give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds of the air, beasts of the earth, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. And all those gathered here will know that it's not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." There's at least 6 God references in that paragraph. Well, now Goliath is really miffed, right? Just as you would expect there. Verse 48, he moved closer to attack him. David ran quickly towards the battle line to meet him. Now, the sling that's mentioned here, Pastor Gerald has actually done a pretty good job of capturing that for us. It's not the typical slingshot, the bead with elastic strands that we think of today. You know, the sling back in the day would have been a leather pouch with a couple leather straps attached to it. The rocks in this region were basically the size of a billiard ball. And so we're not talking pebbles here, but rather serious stone. Back in the day, that combination, that size rock with that sling was a substantial weapon. Those who were skilled in its use could sling a stone 400 yards. They could hit something with precision 200 yards away. That'd be 2 football fields. The rock would be traveling in the neighborhood of 150 miles an hour. Major League Baseball pitchers can occasionally break 100. The rock would be traveling 150 miles an hour. And you see a reference to this actually in the book of Judges. It talks about the Benjamite soldiers, 700 select troops. They were so skilled, left-handed, each of them could sling a stone at a hair and not miss. So back in the day, this was a formidable weapon. And what happens here? Well, I think you probably know. But reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead, and the stone sank into his forehead. And that, of course, calls for the obligatory dad, now grandpa joke. What did Goliath say when the stone sunk into his forehead? He said, "Nothing like this has ever entered my mind before." You have permission to use that, okay? You don't even have to give me credit for it. You have permission to use it. What happened? The stone sank into his forehead, and Goliath fell face down in the ground. Notice the summarization in verse 50. So David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, without a sword in his hand. He struck down the Philistine and killed him. I think it's important for us to note here that seldom are our giants wiped out as quickly as this one. I wish every spiritual battle could be won in a single day with a single stone. David himself would eventually learn that this would be the only conflict that God settled quickly for him. We'll see as we move on in our study that most of his battles would drag on for years. But before we wrap up and head out of here today, let's grapple with this question. Why in the world would David be willing to do this? Why was David willing to put his neck on the line? He wasn't going to earn the title of the new heavyweight champion of the world. It wasn't about the hype or fame. He didn't care about the king's riches or the king's daughter in marriage. Now, I think it's important to note that why he did what he did. He did so in order to prove to everyone that there was a great God in Israel. All that David did, he did for God's glory. He wasn't seeking credit for himself. His number one goal was to bring attention to the one true God. Wasn't that evident there in verse 46? David said, I'll tell you why I'll fight Goliath. I'll tell you why I'll stand alone if necessary. I'll tell you why I'll risk my life in order to be faithful to the Lord. Because today the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. Do you hear the humility in that statement? He says, it's not about me, not about what I did or I do. It's about the God I serve. It's about his fame. It's about his glory. There's another indicator of his humility here as well. I mentioned last Sunday that David wrote a good portion of that book of the Bible we call Psalms. There's 150 Psalms in the Old Testament in that portion or in that book. David wrote approximately 73 of those psalms. Each one is a different song. But here's my point. Do you realize that in all the songs that David wrote, that he never mentioned killing Goliath? Wrote 73 songs and it never came up. Telling you what, gang, that's humility. If I was a songwriter and I killed a giant, I'd written about it. Would have been number one in your hymn book. We would have sang it every Sunday. Turn to hymn number 1. Let's sing about how I killed the giant. You tracking with me this morning? David wasn't saying, hey, look at me. Look how strong I am. No, he was saying, hey, look at God. Look how strong he is. David wasn't trying to make a name for himself. His goal was to exalt the name of God. And everything that we do as believers should be for the purpose of promoting God's interest, God's glory, and not our own. You with me on that? Whenever I preach on a text, I write the date in the margin of my Bible. And I do that just to make sure that I'm not overusing certain passages and I'm aware how often I'm coming back to that particular text. I have not preached on David and Goliath for 19 years. Last time I preached on this passage on a Sunday morning was in 2005. And so the last time I taught this text, the application would have been along the lines of who or what is your giant. In fact, I would have encouraged you, maybe you want to do this right now on the bottom of your outline. Who or what is your giant? And then fill in the blank, right? Could be Could be an addictive habit that you can't conquer. Could be a financial problem. Could be an employer that's causing you job difficulties. Perhaps it's an incurable sickness, a strained relationship, a wayward child. In other words, what is it that's creating the most fear and anxiety in your life? Who or what is your giant? Identify your giant by writing its name on the bottom there of the outline, or at least in your mind, acknowledge who or what it is today, and then write underneath it, but my God is bigger. That's my giant, but my God is bigger. That's how I would have preached this text 19 years ago. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's a solid application. That's good stuff. That still works today. But as we wrap up this morning, I would just want to point out that the landscape has changed since I last preached on this passage. Go back to verse 26 and 46. Look what David asks there. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? Then verse 45, same idea. I come against you. He's talking now to Goliath. I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. See, there's that word I was talking about earlier. What's the issue here? What's the issue? David's primary concern was for the name and reputation of God. That's what he's worked up about here, the name and reputation of God. We are now living in a culture that denies and defiles the name of our God. We're now living in a culture that denies and defiles the things that our God values. We're now living in a culture that denies and defiles the commands of God's written revelation. And I didn't plan it this way, but maybe it just happened in the providence of God that today's message on a fearless heart becomes a perfect lead-in to the film that we'll be showing tonight. We don't have the option of slinging rocks in the direction of our enemies, do we? David lived in a different era. He lived in a different culture. And yet, like David, we'd better be prepared to courageously stand up for truth. Like David, we better be prepared to not back down from our adversaries' intimidation. We're going to need fearless hearts in the days ahead. You with me? The pervasive wickedness spreading throughout this land will require men and women of courage with fearless hearts to stand up and not back down from their convictions. God help us. God help us to be those people. Will you stand with me? We'll close in prayer. God, it's a familiar story today. Many of us have heard it repeatedly down through the years. There are no surprises today. We knew how it was going to end. And yet there's much to glean from this passage. It's timely. It's current to what we're facing today. There's giants in the land. There's giants in our culture. And they're defiling the name of our God. They're defiling the values, the things, the commands and truth that you've imparted to us. And our goal is not to be unnecessarily antagonistic. And yet at the same time, we want to be people who know what we believe and willing to stand on that truth. And I just can't believe, God, but the battle's going to intensify in the days, weeks, months to come. And so help us now to learn from David's example. Help us to decide before the heat comes that we're going to be that people with a fearless heart. We're going to care more about your reputation and your glory than our own. And we'll even be willing to sacrifice and to risk if necessary in order for your name to be exalted. We serve an incredible God. We've got a wonderful mission. Now help us to be faithful to carry it out as we go from this place. Scatter us every direction to make a difference for you, we pray. We ask in Christ's name, and everybody agreed said, Amen. Have a great week.